Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on basic networking fundamentals. Now, in this lesson, I will tell you, well, just like the title says, this is going to be very basic networking fundamentals, or really just kind of the foundation of everything else that we're going to cover in this course. So you might actually feel as we go through this lesson like I'm teasing you, like I might just give you just a little tidbit of information, just enough to kind of salivate your mouth and be like, oh, okay, now I want to know about that. Just in time for me to say, but that's all I'm going to give you right now. And why am I doing that? Well, I like to be mean. No, all kidding aside, the reason I'm doing that is because I need to give you these little tidbits of information so that you can have them in the back of your mind as you learn the details of these different technologies as we go through the course. Okay, there's a lot of these technologies that rely on one another, and so there's kind of that dilemma of how do I learn this when I need to learn this first, but in order to learn this, I have to learn this first. Okay, so I'm going to give you all these small little pieces of all the different technologies so that it will allow you to really get it all to soak in as we go through the rest of the course. So that said, let's go ahead and get started. So to get things started, well, the first thing we need to do is, let's be real. We need to talk about what is a network. Well, a network is created when you have two or more hosts connected together so they can communicate and share resources. Now that was boring, right? Reading some words on a screen to you. Well, I want you to look at those words on the screen, and I actually want you to focus in on two of those words. And the two words we're going to talk about here are hosts and resources. Okay, these are two terms that you need to have a good, solid understanding of in order to truly understand what a network is. Now let's take a look at a diagram of a network. So here we have a picture of, well, looks like a computer, right? Well, guess what? That's what a host is. A host is a computer on a network. Now, one thing I need to point out is if you've ever read any books on this, you've ever studied this before, you've ever been to a class, you may hear slightly different definitions of exactly what a host is. Or you may have heard that a computer is something called a node on a network. I don't want you to get caught up with this, okay? These are all accurate terms. Right now, I'm not looking for 100% technical accuracy. Right now, I want you to have a general understanding that a host is a computer on a network. Okay, those terms are interchangeable. Matter of fact, you'll hear me say the word computer instead of the word host. I always interchange them subconsciously without even thinking. So here we have a computer or a host. Now we need to know what a resource is. Well, a resource is, well, the stuff, okay, the things on that computer. So an example would be, well, here we have a file on the computer. Or we may have a printer hooked up to the computer. These are things. These are things that are available. These are resources that you, the user sitting at the computer, are going to access. So now that we've seen a host and we've seen resources, well, in order to turn this into a network, it's simple. Add one more computer. Right? We added one more computer here. And that computer also, as you can see, has a resource. It has a file on it. And, well, these two computers, or these two hosts, are sharing resources with one another. Now, speaking of the fact that we added one more computer, or the fact that we have two computers, that's the other term that I want you to focus on here. Okay, just real quick, I want you to understand that a network is created when you have two or more, and typically it would be more, but as soon as you have two computers that are sharing resources, you have a network. Now, why am I pointing this out to you? In the real world, when do you see a two-computer network? Not very often, but here's the deal. If you want to follow along in this course and maybe practice some of the concepts that I'm throwing at you, you can do it at home, at the office, wherever you might be, if you can just get two computers talking to each other. Now, the next fundamental that I would like for you to be aware of is the different types of networks that you'll come across. And when I say the types of networks, really we're talking about different, almost networking terminology that you'll run into. The first one I have on the screen for you right now, which is something called a client-server network. And the idea behind a client-server network is that you have each individual computer acting as a client or a server. And "or" would be the operative word here. Okay, in other words, it's only a client or a server. Now, let's first talk about what a client is and what a server is. A server, let's start there, is a computer that is serving the resources. It has the resources and it's making it available to others. Whereas a client is the computer that is accessing those resources. Now, you may already be aware that in many real-world environments, a given computer can have resources that it is serving to other computers, and at the same time, you may be on that computer and accessing resources from others. I don't want you to get confused with all that. Right now, we're talking about just the base fundamentals of what these terms mean. A server, by definition, is serving the resources. A client is accessing the resources. So here, in this example, we have a client-server environment where we have one computer on the screen designated as a server. It has the resources, and those resources are then being made available out to the three clients that you see over on the other side. Now, on the other hand, we have something called a peer-to-peer network. In a peer-to-peer network, every computer on the network is acting as a client and a server at the same time. And so there the operative word is "and." Every computer is acting both as a machine that has resources and making it available to others, as well as a computer that is then accessing resources from its peers. Now, one thing that might help you to understand the difference between these two different types of networks is talking to you about how they're used in the real world. If you've ever heard of a domain or a domain environment, even if you've not dealt with one professionally, maybe you work at a place or you have worked at a place where you log into a domain, that's a very good example of where you will have a client-server type environment, where you have servers, right? And generally those servers are housed in a server room, and you'll have a team of administrators who oversee those servers. And where you're logging into a client. On the other hand, a peer-to-peer network is sometimes referred to as a work group network. Matter of fact, in Microsoft world, it's literally called domain or work group. In that work group environment, this would be like your home or very small network. You don't have any administrators. You're not logging into a domain. You may be logging onto the individual computer just for security purposes, but each and every computer at home, for instance, has its own resources, and those resources can be shared with other computers in the home. Now, there are some other types of networks that are a little bit different than client-server and peer-to-peer, and they are something called LANs, CANs, MANs, and WANs. Or I really could simplify this, and I could just say LANs and WANs. Those are the two terms that you would probably be most familiar with. These are the two most common terms. But we're going to talk about all four of them here. Even though CANs and MANs aren't really used that much anymore, I want you to have an understanding of the history behind this. So first of all, let's start off with the LAN, which stands for Local Area Network. And it means just that. It's a very localized network. The problem that a lot of people run into is, well, what defines localized? Does local mean it is within a room? Does it mean it's within the floor of a building? Does it mean it's within the building? Does it mean it's within the company? What does localized mean? And I will tell you that there is no specific answer to that. What I can tell you is that most typically it's referred to as within the building. And the only place where that gets confusing is when you run into a situation where multiple companies share a building. Then you get my company's LAN versus your company's LAN. So you have multiple LANs within the building. But if you think of it as your company's network within a single building, that is a very simple definition of a LAN. Now let's grow from here. And the first place we can grow to would be a CAN, which stands for Campus Area Network. With a campus area network, you are now extending the network to multiple buildings, but to be specific, you are extending it to multiple contiguous buildings. Or in some cases, it's looked at as multiple buildings which exist on a single property. And if you think of the definition of a campus, or even if you get about the literal definition of a campus, think of where you hear the term campus. Usually it's either a very large business complex, right? You have a property that has a lot of buildings on it and it's all the same company, or a school. Very often at schools, at colleges, right? It'll be one big property, but you have all the different buildings. Those are a campus. So a campus area network is just that. It's a network that extends to all those buildings on that same property. Now, growing our network from there, we go into a MAN, a metropolitan area network. Now, I will tell you that this is a term that, of everything that we're going to go over in this entire lesson, is the least used term by today's standards. And once I explain exactly what it is, I'll explain why we don't use the term very much anymore. A metropolitan area network is where we extend our network out to multiple buildings, so we'll say multiple locations, but still contained within a metropolitan area. The problem is there's, once again, some gray area on what defines a metropolitan area. Now, there's a number of different definitions that I have heard over the years. One definition is that it's within a 100-kilometer radius. That would make it within a metropolitan area. I've heard people talk about, well, if it's near a big city. All right, so I happen to live near Chicago, so if you're within Chicago or the surrounding suburbs, you're within the Chicago metropolitan area. And another definition, and this is the one that really was the main reason we had this term, and also why we don't currently use the term really that much anymore, is if you are within a local calling area. And depending on how old you are, you may not even know what that statement means, local calling area. And that's why we don't use this term very much. Back in the day, when connectivity was all done between locations with dial-up modems, where you literally had to dial a phone number to make that connection, defining that something stayed within a metropolitan area was also stating that we would not incur any long-distance charges from the phone company. These days, there's two reasons that that's not really so much an issue anymore. Number one, calling plans very often just incorporate local and long-distance calling, and that's not really an issue. But the second reason, and much more importantly, is, well, we're not using dial-up modems anymore. Now, everything is done through direct connectivity and high-speed connectivity via the internet. But that's something we'll get into later on. And where we can grow our network from here is really kind of the end-all, be-all of all of this, which is growing it all the way to a WAN, or wide area network. And you may remember when I started this whole series of LANs, CANs, MANs, and WANs, as I said, we could just simplify this with LANs and WANs, right? You're either local or you're wide. And local means you're localized, you're within the building, and wide means you're expanding out of the building. We don't really look at the CANs and MANs too much anymore. But if we did still take those into consideration, where do we define that we've moved out into a wide area network? Well, it means if we are in multiple locations that are not contained within a single metropolitan area. So the example I have on the screen shows offices in 5 different cities around the United States. In this environment, this would be what we would call a WAN, a wide area network. And again, I just want to re-emphasize that in today's world, for the most part, you'll hear people talk about LANs and WANs, and you can get away with just knowing what those are. And if you ever see, let's say, a job posting, maybe you're looking for a job and you see LAN administrator or you see WAN administrator, all you're really seeing is LAN administrator means you're going to work within a building, right? So it's going to be either a smaller company or maybe you're just going to do the one component of that company. Whereas a WAN administrator you're going to be working with multiple locations, making connectivity from one city to another. Now, the next basic networking fundamental that I want to discuss with you is the idea behind how do we get data from a computer over here to a computer over here, right? I mean, how does that happen, right? We know that we have multiple computers on a network, but how does the data get from one place to another? And this is something called network media. Now, one thing that I really need to emphasize here, if we're going to talk about network media, is, real quick, people, when they think of network media, they think of cables, right? We have a computer over here, and then we take this cable and we run it over here to the computer over here, and, well, now they're connected. Well, believe it or not, these days, the network media might just be the air around us. It may be invisible to the naked eye. Okay, it could be what's called wireless network media. Okay, and we'll talk about both wired and wireless network media in more detail as we get later on in the course. Okay, but just real quick here to give you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. I have here one of the most typical network cables that is used in today's, well, at least office networks. Okay, it happens to be a Cat5 twisted pair cable. Some people call it an Ethernet cable. I don't want to get into the details of that right now, but it's just kind of the idea that, well, here's a cable, right? That's the obvious. But what I also have over here is a wireless router. Now, just because I'm showing you a picture of a wireless router, it's really not truly showing you that we're using the invisible airways. But notice that it's this box that has a couple of antennas on it. And that's what those antennas are for. It's for sending and receiving data through the airways. All right, so you need to understand that network media can be physical cable, or it could just be the air around us. Now I want you to become familiar with a term that is used heavily when it comes to computer networking. And that term is protocol. A protocol, by definition, is a set of rules and procedures for communication. Now, what does that mean to computer networking? Well, in order for hosts, or computers, to communicate on a network, they must agree to a common set of rules and procedures, or in other words, they must use the same network protocol. Now, I will tell you that this was something that was of little more concern in the past than it is today. Not to say that the term isn't important. It is. Understanding protocols is very important. But the whole big picture concept of multiple computers having to agree on the same network protocol or use the same network protocol in order to communicate isn't as big a deal. And the reason why is because there is one network protocol which is essentially used everywhere at this point. And that protocol's name is TCP/IP. You may have heard of it. I mean, it's that common of a name. Even if you've never looked at computer networking in your life, and this is the very first time you're ever hearing about this, you still very well likely have heard of the term TCP/IP because it's everywhere. And I will tell you that in TCP/IP, and this is as far as we're going to go because there's a whole lesson on TCP/IP later on in this course, the IP portion stands for Internet Protocol. So you can kind of get an idea, since the Internet is everywhere, the Internet Protocol is something that is used everywhere. But as I said, we will discuss the TCP/IP protocol in much more detail later on in the course. Now, speaking of the IP portion of TCP/IP, that takes us to the next concept that I want to talk to you about. And that's something called IP addressing. And the idea here is, if you're going to have multiple computers on a network, right? You have a computer over here and a computer over here. We talked about these so-called computers. Maybe I should just rename hands as computers. But anyway, these computers over here, in order for them to be able to talk to one another, they have to have some form of addressing so that we know how to get the information from one computer over to the other. And in computer networking, that's called IP addressing. Now, there's something else that I just want to throw one small teaser out, just out there real quick, and that is there's another type of device that's very involved with getting that information from one computer to another, and that's something called a router. Now, I said this is going to be a teaser because I'm not going to go into all the details of what exactly a router is and how it all works. We have a whole lesson on that. But I will tell you that these routers use IP addressing to figure out how to get information from, we'll say, a computer over here on one network to a computer way over here, let's say out on a completely different network. Now, one last thing that I want to do when it comes to the IP addressing concept, to make sure that you firmly understand what I'm talking about, is I want you to think about some other types of networks and how they may function. So let's say like the telephone network, right? If I want to call you, we have to figure out how to get a connection from my phone to your phone, right? We do that with a phone number. Believe it or not, a phone number is a form of address. Or I have one for you. How about the postal network, right? The postal network is a great example to use when trying to think of how addressing works because, well, we use the same terminology. If I want to send you a letter, in order for that letter to get to you, I have to put an address on the envelope. And I will also tell you, and you'll see this in much more detail when we get to the various lessons on TCP/IP and IP addressing, you'll see that the addressing and the way it works with the postal network, where you have a breakdown of that address, right? You have the name, and you have the street number, and street name, and city, and state, and zip code, and country, if it's international. You have all the different components of the address. Well, that's how IP addresses work as well, believe it or not. You may see it as just a bunch of numbers, but there is actually a breakdown, and we're going to learn all about that when we get later on in this course. Now, that does bring us to the end of this lesson, and again, I just kind of want to re-emphasize, because if you're feeling very teased right now, that's okay, because the whole point behind this lesson was just to give you some very basic foundational information, just so you can keep it in the back of your mind, so that as I go into more detail on some of these specific technologies and concepts, you'll hopefully be able to grasp hold of them in a much better way than you would have if I just kind of jumped right into them. All right, so that is all I have for you when it comes to basic networking fundamentals, and I will see you in the next lesson.